Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've decided to have yet another look at some video game history, and in the process answer the question, what exactly made Super Mario Bros. Great? First released all the way back in 1985 for the NES, and getting numerous sequels and ports over the years, Super Mario Bros. Is easily one of the most famous video games ever created, period. It's an entry that needs no introduction from a franchise that needs no introduction, with the main protagonist being so iconic and famous that he was the undisputed face of video games as an industry at the very most conservative up until the early 2000s, and arguably remains so today, though it is of note that he does face stiffer competition these days. So needless to say, Mario as a character and Super Mario Bros. Have had a massive impact on the industry. So much so that a lot of people even wrongfully believe that Super Mario Bros. Is the first entry in the Mario Bros. Franchise. For the record, it very much isn't, but nevertheless, this is truly a revolutionary title in the annals of video game history. So let's talk about what exactly made this game great. And the first thing that helped make this game great was that it pioneered platforming games being side-scrollers. It is important to note that the standard format for platformers at the time that Super Mario Bros. Was released was to have the player navigate a static map that did not move at all. See 1981's Donkey Kong for a good example of what the genre consisted of prior to Super Mario Bros. Of course it works and produces some great games in its own right. Again, see the aforementioned Donkey Kong, but this was also a design that had its limitations. It did, for example, limit the size of the map that you could utilize before your players were essentially moving around an ant on the screen. Additionally, if you wanted to play secrets in your game, well, they could be done, but the fact that you could see the whole map meant that the ability to do so was a bit more limited as well. Thirdly, if you're trying to make a game feel like a bit of a journey, well, showing the end of the level right from the very beginning does hamper that feeling a bit. For these reasons, as well as no doubt numerous others, the introduction of side-scrolling into the platforming formula was very much a big deal, and Super Mario Bros. Did absolutely show what could be accomplished right from the very beginning. But there is, I believe, more to it with regards to what exactly made this game great, as it wasn't just the implementation of side-scrolling to the platforming formula. It was also how the game handled the platforming. The game does actually control pretty well, with the player not only being able to control their movement while even in the air, with the player also being able to control how high they jump with how long they've pressed the A button, as well as be able to jump higher still if they were running at the time that they jumped. Okay, this isn't exactly much of a surprise, but it can't be understated just how utterly critical good controls are to a platformer, and why it was so important that Super Mario Bros. Had good controls, even if there were other games within the genre that also had decent controls at the time. Speaking of how things were within the video game industry at the time, I do believe I need to move on to another thing that helped make the game great. The fact that it was ultimately this game that helped the industry recover from the video game crash of 1983. A crash that was beyond cataclysmic within the industry, which at its lowest point resulted in a 97% drop in sales in comparison to how the industry was prior to the crash. This was a crash that only truly ended with the arrival of the NES and, by extension, Super Mario Bros., which were both tailor-made to avoid the problems that caused the crash of '83. To say that Super Mario Bros. As a game saved the video game industry, at least as far as the console side of things is concerned, is not exactly a far-fetched argument at that point. And sure, it is not the only game responsible for turning things around, but it is easily the most impactful game from that era. Which leads me to another thing that helped make this game great. The fact that it did so well that it became the default game, essentially, for over a decade. Keep in mind, before the transition into full 3D, the standard genre of game, the default genre of game, was 2D side-scrolling platformers. And this wouldn't really start to change until the proper transition into 3D. Oh sure, there were other genres of games at at that time, but they were considered comparatively niche to the absolute behemoth that was the side-scrolling platformer. And that absolute domination within the industry can ultimately be traced back to this one very specific game. But even then, there is one additional element I need to bring up with regards to what helped make this game great. An element that transcends the video game industry itself. And that being that Super Mario Bros. And the NES by extension was a massive gateway into Japanese influence on Western culture. Now these days everyone thinks of anime as having a massive influence on Western culture, and for very good reason, but it is of course important to note that anime only really became mainstream in the West during the late 90s. Prior to the NES, the most famous piece of Japanese media was Godzilla, which at the time appears to have had more of a cult following in the West than anything. Super Mario Bros. And the NES were a very different situation altogether. This was Japan essentially being the video game industry as far as consoles were concerned. A state of affairs that was only further built upon thanks to the rise later on of both Sega and Sony. In fact, it wouldn't be until Microsoft released the original Xbox back in 2001 that we saw serious competition from a console producer that wasn't from Japan. And again, this domination of the industry and massive influence of Japanese culture on Western society can ultimately be traced back to Super Mario Bros. Specifically, and the success it had at a time when the video game industry absolutely needed a success story. In fact, one could even potentially make the argument that the rise in popularity for anime to the point that it became mainstream in the West can in some ways be attributed to the influence that the video game industry itself, which at that point was dominated by Japan, had on Western societies, laying something of a foundation. For what it's worth, that argument would be more speculation, as we don't know how things would have turned out had the world not had the NES, but it does show how far the impact of the NES, and by extension Super Mario Bros., may have had on the entire world. But there is one final thing I do believe I need to bring up with regards to what helped make Super Mario Bros. Great, that being the impact it had on the Mario franchise. As previously mentioned, it wasn't the first game in the series, but the influence it has had on what makes the Mario games is so substantial that it's not difficult to see why there are people who think it is the first Mario game. From the story side of things, it was this game that first gave us Mushroom Kingdom, Bowser, and Princess Peach. Whereas in terms of gameplay, it was also this game that gave us such basic things as being able to defeat enemies by simply jumping on them without having to first knock them upside down or something. Considering how fundamentally basic and core these kinds of things are to what makes Mario, it is again not exactly difficult to see why a lot of people think that this was the first Mario game. And with all of that in mind, this has been Ace, and I hope you'll agree when I say that Super Mario Bros. Is great.